Hello there, and welcome to another episode of Mr. K is Wrong. So, I'm going to debunk one of Mr. K's memes that he posted on Facebook. Mr. K is somebody that I used to know in my high school days, and I debunk the bullcrap that he posts online. And this time, he posted a meme that says, "Nobody rioted for this immigrant," and it shows an image of the person and it notes Iryna Zarutska, a 23-year-old Ukrainian, fled the Russian invasion in 2022 with her family and came to Charlotte, North Carolina, seeking safety and opportunity. Tragically, on August 22nd, 2025, she was brutally killed on a Charlotte light rail train by a repeat offender who should not have been free. Her death shows the dangers of weak law enforcement and policies that fail to prioritize public safety. And the meme continues. Critics note that unlike other high profile cases, there were no protests or riots over Irina's death, highlighting what they see as selective outrage. Her story underscores the need for justice that protects all victims, not just those highlighted by political narratives. End quote. So that's the end of the meme's little explanation here. So I'm going to get into why that's actually more of a sinister meme than you might think on the surface, because it just seems to be innocently saying, why can't we all just treat these acts of violence the same? So, the killing of Iryna Zarutska did draw attention, just not riots. So that's first what I want to note and why the meme is actually incorrect. And I'm also going to get into why some cases keep getting compared by right wingers and why the comparison is so often wrong. So, right wing memes like nobody rioted for this immigrant rely on a basic misunderstanding of why some deaths become national flashpoints and others don't as much. So, the surface claim of the meme is selective outrage, and the deeper message underlying the meme is actually more troubling. And believe it or not, it's actually, like I said, actually a pretty dark underlying message that they're trying to get you to swallow. So, for starters, let's just note that George Floyd, Eric Garner, and Amadou Diallo would have been regarded as random victims were it not for their being killed by police officers. All right? So, that's something you need to understand right away. Like if a person, regardless of their race, is just murdered, it is an unfortunate thing, but it wouldn't necessarily receive widespread attention by protesters. So the reason people protested George Floyd's murder was not his race in isolation. I repeat, it was not just his race in isolation. Now, a lot of people on the right, they don't understand that. It was actually that a police officer acting with state authority killed him. That is actually one of the very most important elements here. The killing was public and documented, so of course people learned about it, and it fit a long pattern of police violence, and accountability was delayed and resisted. Boom, right there. That is a formula if you want to see a formula for mass protests around a certain killing. So that combination turns a killing into a systemic scandal. And protests weren't just about one bad actor, they were about whether the state can abuse its power and escape consequences. So hopefully, already some of you out there might understand the difference. All right? In fact, if you want evidence that these reactions by the left are not solely about race over the years, consider the recent ICE killings of Renee Nicole Good and Alex Preddy in Minnesota, because those people who were killed, those two people, They were, by all appearances, white people. So you might wonder, well, why was there outrage about that? Well, because oddly enough, skin color is not the sole factor when it comes to whether killings are considered outrageous by liberals or leftists or whatever you want to call them. Obviously, the biggest factor is that they were killed by people with authority. In the case of Renee Nicole Good and Alex, it was because they were killed by ICE officers. All right? So that is, again, one of the main factors here. The same is true for Eric Gardner and Amadou Diallo. I don't know if you remember Amadou Diallo, but that happened back in the 90s. And in each case, the outrage centered on government authority, civil rights, and the failure of institutions to police themselves. In the case of Amadou Diallo, he was shot like a ridiculous amount of times and he was unarmed. So, of course, that was going to be scandalous to anybody who has like a conscience. And people were outraged by the police using such excessive force against somebody who was unarmed. All right. And that is the sort of thing that made those cases national. Relatively private murders raise different but narrower questions. So, Iryna Zarutska's murder was horrific and also horrible in the eyes of right wingers because the killer was a black person. All right. And right wingers raised the murder of Cannon Hinnant, who was a child that was murdered, and it was murdered by a black man. And I'm also going to bring up a different murder that received almost and possibly literally zero national coverage. So there was a woman killed some years ago by the name of Geraldine Fouts. And that was a murder that happened where I live and received, again, next to no national coverage. So I happen to know the granddaughter of the murder victim in that case, yet I am not actually outraged that it never became a huge national story because I understand why it did not become such a national story, right? It was sort of, I mean, it sounds like I'm being dismissive here, but nevertheless, it's true. It was a relatively random sort of murder. It was not somebody who was killed by the police. And it's because these were relatively private crimes, not acts of state violence. So again, that is a key difference, just to keep spelling this out again and again and again. So when a private individual commits murder, the system's role is usually limited and clear. All right? Arrest the suspect, prosecute the case, and impose punishment. And that is quite often what happens. There is no larger question about whether the government itself is abusing power, at least in most cases, and as a result, these cases rarely become mass protest movements, even when they devastate families or communities. Now, obviously, if somebody believes that the case is not being properly handled or investigated and all that sort of thing, you might end up with a protest element to that certain case, and that can happen. But it's not going to be considered quite as large of a case as something that involved people in authority murdering somebody. All right? So that's not being selective in your empathy so much as it is a difference in scope. You can still care personally about those cases, especially if they're local and impact you, but they're not necessarily going to be causes for I guess, large scale protests if there was no perceived wrong. So Zarutska's case actually was not ignored. Again, I need to emphasize that. It produced some real consequences. So, contrary to the meme's claim, Zarutska's death prompted national and international media coverage, federal and state charges against the suspect, public condemnation from political leaders, and community vigils and advocacy. So, again, there was no need for a sustained protest involving that particular crime. And most importantly, it led to legislative action. North Carolina passed what is often called Iryna's Law, tightening pretrial release rules and addressing violent repeat offenders. The case also prompted renewed scrutiny of transit safety in Charlotte. So basically, a lot happened, so you can't say that a lot did not happen. And so there's less grounds for a protest. You know what I'm saying? And in fact, if anything, one might think they overcompensated because it adds to the public perception that, well, if anyone ever commits a violent crime, the solution is to just lock them up and throw away the key. You know, the idea that no violent criminal ever deserves a second chance. I think that's what the right wing narrative has fed uh, from this case. And in some cases, that might be unfortunate because, of course, you have killers who have actually reformed, and there might be an argument that, at least in some cases, a person might deserve a second chance. But if you ask certain right wingers, no, they don't deserve a second chance. So, it's one of those things where they, in fact, not only listened to any complaints in this case, but they might have over listened and overcompensated, and they might have crafted a narrative where nobody deserves another chance. I mean, it's a it's an interesting dynamic to this story because the right wingers are asking you to protest something that they've actually won with. This is something where they're presumably getting their way, but they're still trying to act like the outrage wheel needs to keep on turning in this case. But that what happened here is how the system should typically respond to violence, at least from their perspective, especially through prosecution and policy change. Typically, no riots are needed if the system seems responsive. So that's why there was no rioting in this case. And let's get to the racial subtext that keeps getting smuggled in here. It's another pattern that's hard for me to ignore. Zarutska and Canon Hinnon, that I mentioned earlier, are repeatedly highlighted by right wing commentators because their killers happen to be black. Their stories are framed not around systemic reform, but around comparison based on race. So, why did people riot for George Floyd but not for this? That's what they'll keep on arguing in a case like that or in cases like those. But that framing subtly shifts the takeaway from state violence and toward a racial insinuation that the real scandal is simply that black people can murder white people too. That's not what people are saying though on the other side. Of course, everybody can admit that black people can commit crimes including murder. The implication does several things at once of the right wing argument. So it strips out the police abuse angle entirely. It ignores the initial lack of justice that fueled BLM protests and therefore misunderstands, perhaps deliberately, what the debate even is. It reframes anti police brutality movements as racial favoritism rather than demands for accountability when it comes to police abuse or presumably other forms of injustice. And in other words, the comparison isn't just wrong, it changes the subject and seemingly in a deliberate way. Here's how the issue gets deliberately confused. The rhetorical move, it highlights a murder where the perpetrator is black and the victim is white, and it asks why there are no riots. It omits the role of state authority in these BLM cases. It suggests hypocrisy instead of explaining context. And, it overlooks the lack of hypocrisy, actually, because, like I said earlier, race is not actually the sole point in these cases, although it is a contingent. Because, as I noted, when it comes to the ice shooting of Renee Nicole Good and others, it's not about race solely. It's also, or mostly, about the fact that a lot of violence has been done by authority figures against certain people, and that there's no accountability if it's obvious that the killings were, unjustified. So once the right wingers make memes like this, the victim's story becomes a prop. There is rarely sustained advocacy for victim services, violence prevention, or broader public safety reform beyond the talking point itself. It just becomes a way to own the libs while making it look like police abuse and expanded police state powers is the solution to crime, because after all, those dumb liberals are ignoring crimes committed by those sinister minorities. And if true stories are not compelling enough to to convey that attitude, then any lie will do, because they'll say, like, "Oh, those immigrants, they're eating the cats and dogs." Remember that one? So they'll sometimes just make up stories if they feel it's desired. And that might actually be preferable, because a lot of these right wingers, they don't even care if a story is true or not. They don't want to do the research. They just like the narrative. So remember, people protested George Floyd's murder because the government killed someone, and they initially tried to excuse it. And people did not riot over Zarutska's or Cannon Hinnant's murders because they were relatively private crimes that moved through the justice system in the normal way, including arrests, prosecutions, and, in Zarutska's case, legislative reform. So, reducing that distinction to a racial scoreboard does not clarify anything. It obscures the real issue, which is abuse of power versus relatively private violence. So, the grief in such stories is universal, a protest is more targeted, and pretending not to understand the difference is not just confusion, at least in most cases, it's deliberate right wing strategy.